Good evening, my friends. It is always a sacred moment when we come together, not because of words spoken or thoughts exchanged, but because there is, even now, a deeper movement taking place beneath all speech. There is within every one of us a silent reaching, a longing that precedes theology, precedes doctrine, precedes even belief. It is this inner reaching that we have come to call prayer. Prayer did not begin with religion. Prayer did not begin with scripture. Prayer began the moment human consciousness became aware of limitation, of danger, of lack, of uncertainty. From that moment forward, the human heart has cried out, not always to God by name, but to something, to someone, to some power greater than itself. And so prayer, in its earliest form, was simply the cry of the human heart saying, help, or save me, or make me whole. We must understand this if we are to understand why prayer so often seems to fail. For most, prayer is born not of faith, but of fear, not of realization, but of desperation. It is the cry of the human sense of self that believes it is alone, separated, vulnerable, incomplete. And yet, strange as it may seem, this very cry contains within it the seed of its own answer, for no one would cry out unless there were already hidden within consciousness an awareness, however faint, that help exists. Why do men and women pray? They pray because they are sick. They pray because they are afraid. They pray because they are lonely. They pray because their supply seems uncertain. They pray because relationships are strained, because nations are at war, because the world itself appears unstable. But behind all these reasons, there is only one prayer, one cry, one longing, the desire to return to a sense of safety, of peace, of wholeness, of oneness. The tragedy is not that people pray. The tragedy is that they pray as though God were absent. Most prayer assumes that God is somewhere else, perhaps in heaven, perhaps beyond the stars, perhaps waiting to be moved by sincerity or persistence, and so prayer becomes an attempt to reach God, to persuade God, to convince God to act on our behalf. Yet the very God we are praying to has already declared, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. The same God has spoken through the prophet, before they call, I will answer. And while they are yet speaking, I will hear. What then are we calling to? What then are we asking for? There is something deeply moving and deeply revealing in the words of the psalmist. Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord. Out of the depths, not out of understanding, not out of realization, but out of the depths of human sense. And God does not condemn this cry. God does not rebuke it. God receives it, but God does not answer it in the way the human mind expects. You see, prayer is not wrong because it is human. Prayer becomes ineffective only when it remains human. When prayer stays on the level of asking God to change conditions, to fix situations, to remove difficulties, it has not yet risen to the level at which Jesus taught prayer. For Jesus did not teach prayer as a request addressed to a distant deity. He taught prayer as an inner turning, an awakening, a yielding to what already is. The universal cry behind all prayer is the cry of separation. It is the belief that life is happening to us rather than through us. It is the belief that good must be sent to us rather than recognized within us. And as long as this belief remains unchallenged, prayer will continue to be a struggle, sincere, earnest, often beautiful, and yet frequently disappointing. How many have said, "I have prayed for years and nothing has changed"? How many have whispered in the night, "God, why do you not hear me?" And yet, it is not that God has not heard. It is that prayer has been directed outward instead of inward, upward instead of inward, toward an imagined absence instead of a realized presence. Jesus spoke plainly, yet few have heard him. The kingdom of God is within you, not near you, not coming to you, not promised to you someday, within you. And if this is true, and either it is true or Jesus spoke falsely, then prayer cannot be the attempt to bring God into our experience. Prayer must be the recognition of God already present. Here, then, is the quiet question that must be allowed to rise in consciousness, not as an argument, but as an invitation. If God is infinite, omnipresent, and all-loving, what exactly are we asking for when we pray? Are we asking God to be where God already is? Are we asking God to give what God has already given? Are we asking God to do what God is eternally doing? The moment this question is allowed, not answered, but allowed, something begins to shift. The cry of prayer begins to soften. The urgency begins to dissolve, and in its place there appears a gentle awareness that prayer is not about changing God, and it is not even about changing circumstances. Prayer is about awakening from the belief that we are separate from the source of our being. This awakening does not come all at once. It does not come through force of will or intensity of desire. It comes quietly, often unnoticed at first, like the dawn that breaks while the world still sleeps. And it begins with the simple recognition that the very impulse to pray is itself evidence that God is already present, already active, already sustaining us. We are not crying out into emptiness. We are responding to a presence that has never been absent. The cry behind all prayer is not a call across distance. It is a stirring from within. And until this is understood, prayer will continue to feel like effort. When it is understood, prayer begins to feel like rest. Pause here, not in words, but in consciousness. Now we come gently and without judgment to a point that has troubled many sincere hearts. There are those who have prayed faithfully, earnestly, even desperately, and yet have seen little outward change. They have prayed for health, and illness has lingered. They have prayed for supply, and lack has remained. They have prayed for peace, and conflict has continued. And so the unspoken question arises, why does prayer fail? Let us be very clear. Prayer does not fail because God withholds good. Prayer does not fail because the one praying is unworthy or insufficiently spiritual or lacking in faith. Prayer fails only when it is based upon a false premise. And the false premise is this, that God must be asked to become what God already is. Most prayer, as it is commonly practiced, is a request. It is a petition. It is an appeal to a higher power to intervene in human affairs. And while this may appear reverent, it subtly assumes that God is not already present, not already active, not already expressing itself as harmony. The moment we ask God to do something, we have unconsciously declared that God is not already doing it. The moment we ask God to come, we have assumed God is absent. And the moment we ask God to give, we have assumed that God has withheld. This is not a sin. It is a misunderstanding. The human sense of life sees itself as separate from God, from good, from safety, from supply. And from this sense of separation, it prays. It says, God, help me, not realizing that the very breath by which the prayer is spoken is God's life expressing itself. It says, God, give me peace. Not realizing that peace is already present, awaiting recognition. It says, God, heal me. Not realizing that life itself is forever whole. Jesus never prayed in this way. He never pleaded with God to act. He never asked God to change circumstances. He never implored God to heal disease. Instead, he withdrew. He became still. He entered into that inner awareness in which the presence of God was consciously realized. And from that realization, the works followed naturally. When he said, I can of mine own self do nothing, the Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works. He was revealing the secret of prayer. He was not disclaiming power. He was acknowledging its source. He was not asking God to help him. He was yielding human sense to divine activity. Why, then, does prayer as request so often produce no result? Because it keeps consciousness anchored in the belief of separation. It keeps the one praying in the posture of a beggar rather than an heir. It keeps attention fixed on the problem rather than on the presence. And whatever holds our attention governs our experience. Consider this carefully. If prayer is focused on disease, then disease occupies consciousness. If prayer is focused on lack, then lack is being acknowledged as reality. If prayer is focused on fear, then fear is being entertained. And yet the scripture tells us plainly, acknowledge him in all thy ways, and he shall direct thy paths. Not acknowledge the problem, not acknowledge the condition, acknowledge him. This is why Jesus cautioned, take no thought. He was not encouraging carelessness. He was revealing the law of consciousness. Thought given to appearances strengthens appearances. Thought given to God dissolves appearances. Prayer that rehearses problems gives them continuity. Prayer that rests in God allows problems to fade from experience. There is a subtle pride in prayer as request, though it appears humble. It is the belief that we know what should happen, when it should happen, and how God should bring it about. And so prayer becomes an attempt to direct the infinite. Yet God does not need our instructions. God needs only our consent, our willingness to relinquish the belief that we are separate from divine life. When prayer is a request, it places God at a distance. When prayer is recognition, distance disappears. When prayer is effort, it exhausts the mind. When prayer is yielding, it brings rest. Be still and know that I am God. Not be active and persuade. Not be anxious and plead. Be still. Many have asked, why did Jesus say, ask and it shall be given you, if asking is not petition? Because the word ask, as he used it, did not mean to beg. It meant to turn within. It meant to seek with the heart rather than the lips. It meant to knock at the door of inner awareness, not at the gates of heaven. Prayer fails only when it is an attempt to get God to do something. Prayer succeeds when it is the surrender of human will to divine will. Prayer fails when it seeks to add something to life. Prayer succeeds when it recognizes the fullness already present. And so we are not abandoning prayer. We are redeeming it. We are not praying less. We are praying more deeply. We are not turning away from God. We are turning toward God within. When this is understood, prayer ceases to be a struggle. It becomes a sanctuary. It becomes a resting place. And from that rest, the answer appears not because we asked correctly, but because we stopped asking from the standpoint of separation. Now, let us turn our attention not outward to theology, not backward to tradition, but inward to the consciousness from which Jesus spoke. For it is impossible to understand his teaching on prayer unless we are willing to release what we have assumed prayer to be. Jesus did not come to improve religion. He came to reveal a state of consciousness. And when he spoke of prayer, he was not offering a method. He was unveiling a way of being. When ye pray, he said, not if ye pray, but when. He took prayer for granted as something natural, spontaneous, inevitable. Yet what followed those words has been so misunderstood that prayer has become one of the most strained and laborious activities in human experience. When ye pray, he said, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. We have treated this as poetry or metaphor, never realizing that it is precise instruction. Jesus was not speaking symbolically. He was describing an inner act. The closet is not a room. The door is not wood or stone. The Father is not distant. The entire instruction takes place within consciousness. To enter the closet is to withdraw attention from appearances. To shut the door is to close the senses to the testimony of the world. To pray to the Father in secret is to turn awareness inward to that presence which has never left us. And the reward that appears openly is not a miracle performed by God, but the natural manifestation of harmony when consciousness aligns with truth. Jesus never instructed his disciples to pray aloud for results. He never told them to list their needs before God. He never encouraged them to repeat words to gain divine favor. Instead, he warned them not to use vain repetitions, as the heathen do, for they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking. This alone should have ended centuries of misunderstanding. Yet we persisted in believing that prayer is improved by words, strengthened by emotion, and made effective by intensity. The prayer Jesus lived was silent. It was inward. It was a state of communion rather than a request for intervention. When he prayed, he did not ask God to be present. He recognized God's presence. When he prayed, he did not seek guidance. He rested in divine intelligence. When he prayed, he did not hope for power. He yielded to it. Even his words at the tomb of Lazarus reveal this. Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me, and I knew that thou hearest me always. Notice what is absent. There is no plea. There is no urgency. There is no attempt to persuade. There is gratitude, gratitude born not of anticipation, but of certainty. I knew that thou hearest me always. This is not faith-seeking proof. This is realization expressing itself. Here we begin to see why prayer, as commonly practiced, so often produces frustration. It is not aligned with the consciousness from which Jesus prayed. We have tried to use prayer to change conditions without first changing our standpoint. Jesus changed his standpoint, and the conditions followed. He did not pray from the problem. He prayed from God. He did not pray about disease. He prayed from life. He did not pray for supply. He prayed from abundance. And this is why his prayer was effective, not because he was Jesus, but because he understood prayer as recognition rather than request. When he said, ask, and it shall be given you, seek, and ye shall find, knock, and it shall be opened unto you. He was not establishing a spiritual formula. He was describing stages of inner awakening. To ask is to turn within. To seek is to remain attentive. To knock is to persist in awareness until the door of realization opens. None of this has anything to do with words spoken outwardly. All of it takes place in consciousness. We have imagined prayer as an activity directed toward God. Jesus revealed prayer as an activity in which the sense of separation dissolves. He was not trying to get God's attention. He was releasing the belief that God was absent. And when that belief fell away, the presence and power of God stood revealed right where he was. This is why Jesus could say, "The Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works." He was not sharing responsibility with God. He was surrendering personal sense entirely. Prayer, in his teaching, was not something done by a person. It was something that happened when the person ceased to interfere. This redefinition of prayer is radical, and it is unsettling to the human mind, for it means that prayer does not give us control. It gives us rest. It does not make us powerful. It reveals the power already present. It does not add God to our lives. It removes the belief that God was ever absent. Until this is understood, prayer will always feel like effort. When it is understood, prayer becomes as natural as breathing. And just as we do not breathe to persuade the air to sustain us, we do not pray to persuade God to bless us. We breathe because air is present. We pray because God is present. Prayer, then, is not something we do to God. Prayer is what happens when we stop doing and begin being. It is the stillness in which truth reveals itself. It is the silence in which the voice of God is heard, not audibly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. When ye pray, Jesus said. He assumed that one day we would understand what prayer truly is. And that understanding begins when we are willing to lay aside the prayer of asking and enter the prayer of recognition. Now we come to a word so familiar that its meaning has been almost entirely lost to us. Jesus said, "Ask, and it shall be given you." And immediately the human mind translated that word ask into begging, pleading, requesting, persuading. Yet the word, as he used it, carries no such implication. It does not mean to entreat a distant God. It means to turn within and become aware. To ask, in the spiritual sense, is not to speak. It is to acknowledge. It is to recognize. It is to yield the belief that something is missing and rest in the awareness of what already is. The moment prayer becomes verbal petition, it has already moved away from its true function. Words belong to the mind. Prayer belongs to consciousness. Consider this carefully. When you say, "God, give me peace," you are affirming that peace is absent. When you say, "God, bring me guidance," you are affirming that intelligence is lacking. When you say, "God, heal me," you are affirming that life is broken. These statements may sound humble, but they are actually declarations of separation. They testify to a world in which God is not yet fully present. Jesus did not pray this way. He did not say, "Father, give me life," because he knew, "I am the resurrection and the life." He did not say, "Father, send me power," because he knew, "All power is given unto me in heaven and in earth." He did not say, "Father, show me the way," because he knew, "I am the way." These were not claims of personal greatness. They were acknowledgments of divine presence, realized. To ask, as Jesus taught it, is to turn away from appearances and inward toward being. It is to become still enough to feel, to know, to recognize that the presence you seek has never departed. It is not an action directed outward. It is an inward consent. There is a moment, often brief at first, when the asking ceases to be verbal and becomes silent awareness. In that moment, there is no longer a person praying to God. There is only the awareness of God. And in that awareness, prayer has already been answered. This is why true prayer carries no strain, it has no tension, it has no urgency, it does not attempt to make something happen, it simply rests in the fact of God's being. The human mind may protest, but nothing has changed. Yet something has changed. Consciousness has shifted. And when consciousness shifts, the outer world follows, quietly and naturally. We must learn to trust this inner recognition. We have been taught to trust words, formulas, affirmations, declarations. But Jesus trusted silence. He trusted awareness. He trusted the Father within to know what was needed before it was asked. Your Father knoweth what things ye have need of before ye ask him. If this is true, and again, either it is true or it is not, then asking cannot be informing God. It must be aligning ourselves with what God already knows. When prayer becomes recognition, it ceases to be repetitive. There is no need to say the same thing again and again. There is no need to remind God. There is no need to convince. One moment of true recognition is worth more than hours of verbal petition. One instant of awareness does more than 1,000 words spoken in fear. This is why the saints and mystics have always returned to silence. They discovered, through experience, that the deepest asking has no words. It is the still turning of the heart. It is the quiet yielding of the mind. It is the gentle letting go of personal will. And here we encounter something that may feel uncomfortable to the human sense. When we truly ask in this way, we do not direct the outcome. We do not specify the form. We do not outline the method. We simply rest in God. And God, being infinite intelligence, expresses harmony in the way that is most natural, most complete, most loving. We often say, I asked, but I did not receive. Yet what we usually mean is, I asked for a specific outcome, and it did not appear in the way I expected. Divine answers are not limited by human expectations. They do not always arrive wearing the form we imagined. Sometimes they arrive as release rather than acquisition, as peace rather than change, as understanding rather than event. To ask rightly is to let go of the demand that life conform to our picture of good. It is to trust the goodness of God more than the images of the human mind. It is to rest in the awareness that the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Not because we have asked correctly, but because we have recognized what already is. As this becomes clearer, prayer grows simpler. We speak less. We think less. We listen more. We wait not with anxiety, but with quiet expectancy. And in that waiting, we find that we are not waiting for God. We are waiting in God. When asking becomes recognition, prayer becomes effortless. It is no longer something we do at certain times. It becomes a state of consciousness that accompanies us through the day. Whether we are walking, working, or resting, the awareness remains. God is here. God is present. God is doing the work. And when that awareness is present, asking has fulfilled its purpose. Now we arrive at a point so simple that the human mind continually overlooks it. Every spiritual demonstration, whether of healing, guidance, supply, or peace, has one common beginning. It does not begin with words. It does not begin with thought. It begins with silence. Silence is not the absence of sound. Silence is the absence of personal effort. It is the stilling of that restless activity of the human mind which forever seeks to improve, to fix, to control, to outline. Silence is the moment in which the human will steps aside and allows divine will to be known. And until this moment arrives, prayer remains human in origin and limited in effect. We have been conditioned to believe that silence is emptiness. We fear it. We rush to fill it with words, affirmations, scriptures, requests. Yet silence is fullness. It is the atmosphere in which God is recognized. Scripture has told us this plainly: be still and know that I am God. It does not say be active and know. It does not say speak and know. It says be still. Jesus never performed a work from mental activity. He withdrew from the crowd. He withdrew from conversation. He withdrew from personal sense. Again and again we read that he went apart into a mountain or into the wilderness or into a quiet place. This was not to escape people. It was to escape appearances. It was to rest in that inner stillness where the presence of God could be consciously realized. Silence precedes demonstration because silence is the end of interference. The human mind, with all its good intentions, interferes constantly with the flow of divine harmony. It tries to help God by thinking. It tries to assist God by planning. It tries to support God by anxiety. Yet none of these are required. God needs no support from the human mind. God requires only one thing: our willingness to be still. In silence, the personal sense of I relaxes, the sense of being a separate doer begins to fade, and in that fading, something else becomes evident. A deeper awareness arises, not emotional, not dramatic, but unmistakable. It is the awareness of presence. It is the awareness that I am not alone, not as a belief, but as a knowing. This awareness cannot be forced. It cannot be manufactured. It cannot be reached through mental effort. It comes when effort ceases. It comes when the mind stops reaching outward and begins resting inward. And when it comes, it brings with it a sense of assurance that needs no explanation. Here is where many become discouraged. They sit in silence for a few moments, perhaps a few minutes, and say, nothing happened, but something did happen. The habit of mental activity was interrupted. The momentum of fear was slowed. The door was opened, even if only slightly. We must not judge silence by sensation. Silence works below the level of sensation. It changes consciousness first and experience later. There may be times when silence brings a sudden awareness, a warmth, a peace, a deep breath, a quiet joy. There may be other times when silence seems uneventful. Both are equally valid. Silence is not practiced to gain an experience. Silence is practiced to remove resistance. And when resistance is gone, the presence of God stands revealed of its own accord. This is why one moment of true stillness can do more than hours of anxious prayer. In that moment, the mind stops insisting. The will stops outlining. The problem is no longer being rehearsed, and In the absence of rehearsal, the problem loses its hold on consciousness. You see, God does not respond to words. God responds to availability. God does not require our understanding. God requires our receptivity. Silence is the language of receptivity. It is the posture of listening rather than speaking. And in listening, we discover that God has been speaking all along, not in sentences, not in instructions, but in the quiet assurance of being. When silence becomes natural to us, prayer changes its character entirely. We no longer go to prayer to do something. We go to prayer to stop doing. We do not seek to make something happen. We seek to let something happen, and that something is always the same, the recognition of God's presence where we are. Out of this silence comes right action. Out of this silence comes healing. Out of this silence comes supply. Not because silence causes these things, but because silence removes the obstruction that prevented them from appearing. The Father that dwelleth within does the work, but only when the personal sense has ceased to intrude. This is the reason Jesus could say, "My peace I give unto you." Peace was not the result of his works. Peace was the condition from which his works flowed. And that peace was born in silence. As we begin to understand this, we stop striving to pray correctly. We stop measuring prayer by results. We begin instead to value the stillness itself. And in that stillness, without effort, without strain, without manipulation, the evidence of God's presence begins to appear in our experience. Silence, then, is not a technique. It is a surrender. It is the laying down of personal sense. It is the acknowledgement that the Father knoweth, and when that acknowledgement is genuine, the demonstration is inevitable. Now we must look squarely and without fear at the belief that prayer goes unanswered. This belief has caused more discouragement than perhaps any other single misunderstanding in spiritual life. Many have turned away from prayer, not because they were irreverent, but because they were sincere and disappointed. They prayed, and nothing appeared to happen. And so they concluded that prayer is unreliable, or that God is distant, or that something in themselves was lacking. Let us be very clear. Prayer is never unanswered. What appears as unanswered prayer is simply prayer whose answer has been misunderstood. The human mind looks for results in forms. It looks for visible changes, immediate relief, dramatic improvement. And when these do not appear, it assumes that nothing has taken place. But prayer does not begin in form. Prayer begins in consciousness, and consciousness must change before form can change. When prayer is true, when it is recognition rather than request, it produces an inner adjustment first. This adjustment may be subtle. It may be so gentle that the human mind scarcely notices it. There may be a slight easing of fear, a quiet sense of reassurance, a momentary stillness. And because these changes do not look like answers, they are often dismissed. Yet these are the very signs that prayer has reached its mark. The peace of God, which passeth all understanding, Paul tells us, shall keep your hearts and minds. Peace is not the reward after the answer appears. Peace is the evidence that the answer is already operative. Peace is the sign that God has been recognized. And once God is recognized, the outward adjustment must follow, because consciousness and experience are not separate. We must learn to stop watching the outer picture for proof. Watching keeps attention fixed on appearances. Watching reinforces the belief that conditions have power. True prayer releases the need to watch. It rests. It leaves the problem with God. And when the problem is truly left, it begins to lose substance, influence, and continuity. Often the answer to prayer does not come as an addition, but as a subtraction. Fear is removed, tension dissolves, anxiety fades, and because we were expecting something to be given, we do not recognize that something has been taken away. Yet what greater answer could there be than the removal of the very state of consciousness that produced the problem? Sometimes prayer does not change the outer situation at all, yet it changes our relationship to it. And in that change of relationship, the situation itself begins to transform. We no longer meet it with resistance. We no longer meet it with fear. We meet it with peace. And peace has a way of dissolving what force cannot touch. There are also times when prayer appears to do nothing for long periods. Days pass, weeks pass, and still the condition remains. This does not mean prayer has failed. It means that the human sense has not yet fully yielded. Old patterns of thought, long-established fears, deeply rooted beliefs do not always dissolve at once, but every moment of true prayer weakens them. Every instant of recognition loosens their hold. We must remember that Jesus never measured prayer by time. He did not say, if nothing happens quickly, begin again. He rested in the certainty of God's presence. And that certainty carried its own timing, its own order, its own perfection. Divine law is never hurried, and it is never late. There is another aspect of unanswered prayer that must be understood. Many times the answer comes in a form we did not anticipate. We prayed for a certain condition, and instead a door closed. We prayed for one outcome, and another appeared, and we called this failure. Yet it may have been protection, it may have been guidance, it may have been grace appearing in a form we did not yet understand. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. This is not poetry, it is instruction. Our understanding is limited. God's understanding is infinite. And prayer is effective only when we are willing to release our understanding and rest in God's. When we insist on a particular outcome, we limit the answer. When we rest in God, the answer is free to appear in its own perfect way. And often, long after the prayer has been forgotten, we look back and see that what we once called unanswered was in truth the most merciful answer possible. The illusion of unanswered prayer dissolves when we realize that prayer is not an attempt to change God's will. Prayer is the yielding of human will to divine will, and divine will is always expressing harmony, even when the human mind cannot yet see it. Therefore, when nothing seems to change, do not conclude that prayer has failed. Do not repeat words in frustration. Do not begin again from fear. Instead, return to stillness. Return to recognition. Return to that quiet awareness of God's presence. And trust that the Father which seeth in secret is working silently, gently, unfailingly. Prayer does not need our supervision. Prayer does not need our anxiety. Prayer needs only our trust. And when trust replaces effort, the illusion of unanswered prayer fades, and the quiet unfoldment of divine order becomes evident. Now we come to a teaching of Jesus that has been repeated for centuries and yet rarely understood. When thou prayest, he said, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret. This was not a warning against sincerity, nor was it a condemnation of communal worship. It was a revelation of the nature of prayer itself. Prayer, in its true sense, is sacred. It is intimate. It is the most personal relationship in human experience. And because of this, it cannot thrive in display. The moment prayer becomes something observed, something demonstrated, something performed, it has already shifted from communion to self-consciousness. It has moved from God awareness to self-awareness. Public prayer easily becomes an activity of the personal sense. Even when sincere, it invites comparison, approval, and judgment either of ourselves or of others. It tempts the mind to measure, to impress, to be heard. And Jesus knew that this subtle movement of ego, however innocent it may appear, interrupts the stillness in which God is recognized. Enter into thy closet. The closet is not a physical space. It is an inner withdrawal. It is the turning away from appearances, from opinions, from the testimony of the senses. To shut the door is to close consciousness to the noise of the world, not only the noise of sound, but the noise of thought, fear, memory, and expectation. When we close the door in this way, no one can see us pray, not because prayer is hidden, but because prayer has ceased to be an outward act. It has become an inward state. The lips may be silent, the mind may be quiet, and yet prayer is taking place more deeply than words could ever reach. Jesus was not discouraging prayer with others. He himself said, "Where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them." But notice the condition, in my name, not in personal desire, not in shared fear, not in collective pleading, but in the consciousness of Christ, where personal sense is laid down and divine presence is recognized. True prayer, whether alone or together, is always inward. It does not require a certain posture, a certain place, or a certain time. One may be sitting quietly, walking down a street, riding on a bus, or working with the hands. If attention has turned inward to the presence of God, prayer is occurring, and no one looking on would know it. This secrecy is not concealment, it is reverence. There are relationships we do not display because they are too sacred for exposure. And prayer is such a relationship. It is the meeting place of God and consciousness. It is the holy ground upon which one stands, unseen and untouched by the world. When Jesus said that the Father who sees in secret will reward openly, he was revealing a law. Inner recognition produces outer manifestation. The world may not see the prayer, but it will see the effect. Peace will be evident. Wisdom will be expressed. Harmony will appear. And because these fruits arise naturally, without announcement, they bear witness to God rather than to a person. Public prayer often seeks to change the world. Secret prayer changes consciousness. And when consciousness changes, the world responds of its own accord. There is no need to tell others what has been discovered. Life will speak. Experience will testify. The fruits will appear in due season. There is also another reason Jesus warned against public prayer. Public prayer often tempts us to bring our problems with us, to name them, describe them, explain them. Secret prayer does not. In the silence of the inner sanctuary, problems lose their language. They cannot speak, they cannot argue, they cannot demand attention, and in that silence, they begin to dissolve. When we enter the closet of inner awareness, we do not take disease with us. We do not take lack with us. We do not take fear with us. we take only ourselves, and even that self is gently laid down. What remains is God. And where God is consciously present, discord cannot maintain itself. This is why prayer becomes simpler as it becomes deeper. We no longer need to say much. We no longer need to explain. We no longer need to persuade. We enter the inner sanctuary, shut the door, and rest. And in that resting, the presence reveals itself. Jesus did not come to teach us how to pray publicly. He came to teach us how to pray truly. And true prayer is always a return to the inner sanctuary, where the Father and the child are one, where words fall away, and where the still small voice is heard. Now we come to a point that often startles the human mind, because it runs directly counter to everything we have been taught about prayer. Jesus did not take problems into prayer. He did not carry disease, lack, sin, or danger into the presence of God. He did not rehearse conditions before the Father. He entered prayer without problems, and from that state, problems disappeared. This is not because problems were ignored, nor because suffering was denied in a human sense. It is because Jesus understood that problems have no place in divine consciousness. They exist only within the human sense of life, and the moment attention is withdrawn from that sense, their seeming reality begins to dissolve. When Jesus said, "Judge not, that ye be not judged," he was not speaking merely of moral judgment. He was speaking of mental judgment, the habit of labeling conditions as real, dangerous, powerful, or personal. To take a problem into prayer is to judge it as something that must be dealt with. To leave it outside is to acknowledge that God has already dealt with it. This is why he could stand before sickness and say nothing, do nothing, explain nothing. He did not analyze disease. He did not trace causes. He did not attempt to understand symptoms. He recognized only one presence, one power, one life. And in the light of that recognition, the appearance called disease lost its hold. The human mind finds this difficult because it believes that ignoring a problem is irresponsible. Yet spiritual prayer is not ignoring, it is transcending. It is not pretending that something is not there. It is recognizing that what appears there has no law to support it. It is seeing through appearances to reality. We are accustomed to saying, "I must take this problem to God." But God does not receive problems. God is not a container for human fear. God is infinite being, and when consciousness enters into awareness of God, there is no room left for problems to occupy. This is why prayer becomes ineffective when it is filled with concern. Concern keeps the mind anchored in appearances. Concern keeps the problem alive. Concern keeps attention divided. Jesus did not pray with divided attention. He did not look at God and the problem at the same time. He looked only at God. When prayer is true, there is a moment, sometimes brief, sometimes sustained, when the problem drops away from consciousness. It may still exist in memory, it may still exist in the outer picture, but it no longer occupies the center. And when it loses its place in consciousness, it loses its power to govern experience. Here is a truth that must be quietly received rather than argued with. You do not need to know anything about a problem in order to be free of it. You do not need to understand its causes. You do not need to diagnose it. You do not need to name it correctly. One thing alone is required, the realization of God's presence. Jesus did not heal by knowing about disease. He healed by knowing God. He did not free people from lack by understanding economics. He freed them by understanding life as infinite supply. He did not overcome sin by condemning it. He overcame it by revealing the Christ. This is why prayer, without problems, feels strange at first. The mind wants something to do. It wants something to fix. It wants something to focus on. But prayer is not the place for mental activity. Prayer is the place where activity ceases. When you enter prayer, leave the problem at the door. Do not carry it in. Do not describe it. Do not fear it. Do not defend against it. Enter prayer with nothing but yourself, and then be willing even to lay that self down. What remains is God. In that remaining, something very gentle occurs. There is a sense of release, a loosening, a quiet confidence. You may not yet see how the problem will be resolved. That is not required. The peace that comes is the assurance that the problem is no longer yours to solve. This peace is not indifference. It is trust. It is the deep inner knowing that the Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works. And when the Father is doing the work, the human mind can rest. Prayer without problems is not a discipline. It is a discovery. It is the discovery that problems do not belong in the presence of God, and that when we enter that presence consciously, problems fade into nothingness, not by force, not by denial, but by the simple fact that they cannot exist where God is realized. This is the prayer Jesus practiced. This is the prayer he lived. And this is the prayer he silently taught, knowing that it could not be understood by instruction alone, but only by experience. Now we come to the one sign by which true prayer may always be known. Not a changed condition, not a visible result, not a sudden improvement in circumstance. The only reliable sign that prayer has taken place is peace. Not human peace, not relief, not optimism, but the peace of God, which passeth all understanding. This peace does not come from reasoning. It does not come from hope. It does not come from believing that things will work out. It comes when the personal sense has yielded, even slightly, to the awareness of God's presence. And when it comes, it does not argue. It does not explain itself. It simply is. Many have mistaken emotional uplift for prayer. They leave prayer feeling inspired, energized, encouraged, and then the fear returns. That was not prayer. That was emotion. True prayer leaves one quiet, still, settled, and even if the problem remains outwardly unchanged, the inner agitation has ceased. This peace is not dependent on outcome. It does not wait to see what will happen. It rests now. And because it rests now, it is evidence that prayer has reached beyond the human mind into the realm of spiritual consciousness. Jesus never said, "By their results ye shall know them." He said, "By their fruits ye shall know them." Peace is the first fruit. Everything else follows. When peace is present, guidance unfolds naturally. When peace is present, right action appears without strain. When peace is present, the outer picture begins to adjust in ways that cannot be forced or predicted. This peace cannot be manufactured. You cannot talk yourself into it. You cannot affirm it into being. You cannot demand it. It comes when resistance ends. It comes when the struggle to pray correctly dissolves. It comes when we stop trying to reach God and realize that God has already reached us. Often this peace comes unexpectedly. You may enter prayer with a heavy heart, a troubled mind, a sense of urgency. And then, without warning, the urgency lifts. The weight eases. The mind grows quiet. Nothing dramatic has happened yet. Everything has changed. This is the moment when prayer has occurred. Do not underestimate this moment. Do not rush past it. Do not immediately begin thinking about what should happen next. Rest in it. Honor it. For this peace is not the result of prayer. It is the activity of God recognized. And where God is recognized, the work is already underway. It is here that many make a subtle mistake. They experience peace and then say, "Now let me hold on to this." But peace cannot be held. It is not a possession. It is a state of consciousness. And the attempt to hold it reintroduces effort. Instead, let peace hold you. Let it carry you through the day. Let it accompany you into action. Let it remain the silent background of your thought. When peace is present, fear has lost its authority. Fear may still whisper, but it no longer commands. Circumstances may still speak, but they no longer dominate. Peace does not argue with fear. It renders fear irrelevant. This is why Paul could write from prison, "I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content." Contentment was not resignation. It was recognition. It was the awareness that God was present even there. And because God was present, no situation could define him. The peace that passes understanding does not come from knowing why things are happening. It comes from knowing where you are resting in God. And once you know where you are, the need to understand why diminishes. Therefore, never measure prayer by outer signs. Measure prayer by inner peace. If peace is present, prayer has been effective. If peace is absent, prayer has not yet gone deep enough. Return, then, not to words, not to effort, not to analysis, but to stillness. Peace is not the end of prayer. Peace is the beginning of living prayer. From peace flows wisdom. From peace flows compassion. From peace flows healing. And from peace flows the quiet confidence that allows life to unfold without strain. This peace is the inheritance of every child of God. It is not reserved for the spiritually advanced. It is not earned through discipline. It is revealed through surrender. And when it is revealed, it carries with it the assurance that all is well, even before the evidence appears. There comes a moment on this path when prayer ceases to be something we do and becomes something we are. Until that moment, prayer appears as an activity. Morning prayer, evening prayer, prayer for healing, prayer for supply, prayer for guidance. All of these have their place, but they are not the fulfillment. They are the doorway. Living in prayer means that we no longer turn to God only in moments of need. We no longer wait for difficulty to remind us of divine presence. Prayer becomes a quiet, continuous awareness that underlies every moment of life. It is not concentration. It is not effort. It is remembrance. When prayer becomes a state of being, we discover that we are never outside of God. We are never separated from guidance. We are never without supply. We are never abandoned to circumstance. The realization dawns not as a thought, but as an inner knowing that I and my Father are one, and that this oneness does not come and go. At this stage, prayer is no longer directed toward God. It is communion with God. We are not speaking to a distant power. We are resting in an ever-present presence. And in this resting, life begins to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. We notice that reactions soften. Where once we were quick to judge, we pause. Where once we hurried to defend, we listen. Where once we rushed to fix, we wait. Not because we have become passive, but because we have become attuned. Action now arises out of stillness, not anxiety. This is the meaning of acknowledge him in all thy ways. It does not mean repeating God's name throughout the day. It means recognizing divine presence before thought forms opinions, before speech takes shape, before action begins. It means allowing God to be the consciousness in which thought, speech, and action occur. Living in prayer does not remove us from the world. It returns us to the world, rightly related. We still work, still serve, still love, still decide, but we do so without the burden of personal responsibility. We are no longer the doer. We are the witness through which the doing flows. Jesus lived this way. He did not retreat from life. He walked directly into it, into crowds, into conflict, into suffering, yet he remained inwardly undisturbed. Why? Because his life was not lived from the surface of human reaction. It was lived from the depth of divine awareness. When prayer becomes a state of being, fear no longer governs decisions. We do not ask, what if this fails? We ask, what is being revealed? We do not ask, how can I protect myself? We ask, how may I be an instrument? And often we do not even ask, we listen. At this level, prayer is silent more often than spoken. It is a listening attitude. It is a readiness to receive rather than a desire to obtain. We are no longer trying to persuade God. We are allowing ourselves to be persuaded by truth. This is why Jesus said, take no thought. He did not mean become careless or irresponsible. He meant stop assuming that life depends on personal planning, personal anxiety, personal control. Life is sustained by God. Direction comes from within. Supply flows through consciousness, not effort. Living in prayer does not mean we will never face challenges. It means challenges no longer define us. They pass through awareness without lodging there. They are met not with resistance, but with recognition. And recognition dissolves what resistance strengthens. As this way of living unfolds, something else becomes evident. Prayer blesses without intention. We find that those around us are helped without our trying to help them. Harmony appears in relationships without effort. Healing occurs without treatment, not because we are doing anything special, but because we are no longer obstructing the flow of grace. This is the hidden ministry of the contemplative life. It does not advertise itself. It does not announce its results. It does not seek recognition. It simply abides, and in abiding, it blesses. Eventually, even the distinction between prayer time and daily life fades. Washing dishes, walking down the street, speaking with a friend, all become occasions of communion. The inner sanctuary is never closed. The door is always open. The presence is always near. This is what it means to pray without ceasing. Not endless words, not constant requests, but unbroken awareness. A life lived from within, a life lived as listening. And when life is lived this way, one discovers the great secret. Nothing is missing. Nothing needs to be added. The kingdom of God is not approaching, it is here. It is not arriving, it is present. And it is not reserved for another time or place. It is revealed now. So we do not strive to become spiritual. We do not struggle to attain Christ consciousness. We simply yield to what already is. We allow the light to shine that has always been shining. We let the imprisoned splendor escape, and in this letting, life becomes simpler, quieter, deeper, not free from human experience, but free from bondage to it. We live, yet not we, but the life of God, living itself as us. This is living prayer. This is the end of seeking. This is the beginning of rest.